Have you ever thought about pulling a heist on cursed treasure located in an entrance to the underworld? Well, these people did. Find a Radio Season 1, Episode 3, Get Rich or Die Trying. I'm Joe. And this episode was a fun one to make. It was a lot of research into some accounts that were pretty creepy. And this is, we'll do a little asterisk right now, but a lot of these stories and events and research I've done on this particular episode come from word of mouth, eyewitness accounts, but nothing that was documented like it is now. So we're talking about the Lost Dutchman mine located in the Lost Dutchman State Park, a few miles east of Phoenix, Arizona, in the Superstation Mountains. So we're talking about the 1800s to early 1900s. We're getting a lot of our information from accounts of prospectors, miners, and kind of all around quiet people. We won't refer to them as shady or criminals or whatever they may or may not be, but just keep that in mind with some of these stories. If you're the type of person that listens to a podcast and is digging for historical accuracy and always has a Google window open ready to fact check everything, maybe not do that for this one, because this is a story. This is not a deposition. Anyway, but this episode is a mild dot connector for me, maybe to a larger thought about what's literally right around us. And just kind of keep that in the back of your head. There's the highways and roads that we drive on every day or drive on to, go visit people or go somewhere far away, and we just kind of stick to those roads. But next time you're out and about and you see an area that's a little more rural, something a little more wild, just look at it and think, man, when's the last time somebody stood 200 feet that way? What's over there? It's interesting. We think we know it all. We see it all in this land, and this area right down the road from where I live is interesting. So that's a good word for this episode. Interesting. All right. So have you heard of the Lost Dutchman? No. Okay. Or the Lost Dutchman mine? No. Well, that's cool. Listen up. It's a great story. If you know all about the Lost Dutchman and the Lost Dutchman mine, then you already know that this is a weird one. So let's start with the area. The aptly named Lost Dutchman State Park is 159,757 acres of pure spookiness right here in the middle of the Sonoran Desert, containing the Superstation Mountains in a town called Apache Junction, which is just east of Phoenix, Arizona. And Apache Junction is obviously Apache territory, named after the Apache tribe, and this is where they used to reside too. And it's right on the border of the Tonto National Forest, which is this massive, massive forest which stretches many, many miles. Anyway, getting into the occupants of this land, the Apache were believed to be a very aggressive and violent tribe, almost like they could cloak due to their familiarity with the land, the lay of it. This was their stomping grounds. And a lot of these ambushes of settlers, prospectors, military soldiers, and anybody out in the area can account to how methodical the ambush was with the military precision that they would execute it. It was they were known for their conflict with a lot of other tribes as well. I don't mean to paint a picture of them as some sort of bully, but this was their style back then. So you think in a lot of native cultures, they get their traits and their beliefs from their ancestors and their spirits, and they believe that right there in the Superstation Mountains was a hole into a cave, which led to what they called the lower world, but we can all kind of agree is more like a underworld area. And that's also where the Thunder God stories originated from, that they believe that the god of thunder lives in the superstitions. And if you get pretty wild on Google Image and look at some images of maybe some monsoons, Superstation Mountains, however you want to search for it, there's some that kind of do look like the clouds are coming from within. It's weird, but who knows? But given some of these events that we're going to talk about, maybe there's more to it than just a story. There's some interesting things. Again, interesting. I like that word. All right. So we're going to start with a family by the name of the Peraltas. And they were a wealthy family from northern Mexico. And in the 1600s, they allegedly had a land grant from the King of Spain to lay claim to this particular area. Obviously, this was before Arizona was a state, and a lot of this territory was simply that, and it became the possession of whoever was occupying it by violence, force, whatever. But there seemed to be this coexistence between the Peraltas and the Apache of the time, and that might have been when the Apache were definitely in smaller numbers, but still laying claim to this territory as well. So who knows? Maybe they never crossed paths as much. It's interesting, but just to think that a legacy of the Apache to allow the Peraltas to do what they were doing there, which we'll get into, is a head scratcher, but we'll see. So we're going into about the 1840s. And the Peraltas would run these expeditions from Mexico up to the Superstitions, outside of Phoenix. 15, 20, 25 people, men, donkeys, all that stuff. And they were just pulling out massive amounts of gold and taking it back to Mexico and not really hiding it too well, not really looking to hide it, just going to get it, walking back. It's been a lot of accounts and depictions of what that would look like. They seem to feel pretty proud of their abilities and able to defend themselves, and that's how that went. But in 1848, another routine expedition, they were ambushed by the Apaches, and most of them were killed. It was anywhere between 18, 21, we'll call them prospectors, were killed. But they were killed in bad ways. Like, their heads were cut off, and their bodies were here, and their heads were miles away. Some of them stacked up. And one of the skulls was filled with gold. It's pretty gnarly. And you think about the symbology behind that, is that kind of winking at them like, we know what you're doing, stop, because the gold obviously didn't have much value to them, and I would find it hard to believe to think the Apaches didn't know about that particular area that they were pulling gold from. But that's the Peraltas were doing this in other places as well. They had other mines and things like that, California and Nevada. So after that, they didn't really hang around too much in Arizona. So then let's get into the man himself. His name is Jacob Walls, or Waltz, depending on your account. And he's the Dutchman. It was a German-born immigrant who relocated to California. I guess we'll say relocated. I don't know what... Seems like a pretty easy way to describe a journey from Germany to California back then, but whatever. in the 1860s, and he was kind of like a getting set up, establishing his roots, finding work where he can in, the California gold rush of the time, and wasn't very good at it. Not very good at prospecting, not very good at mining, maybe not very strong, maybe some extracurriculars. It's hard to know, but he ultimately started stealing and skimming and things like that. So he was kind of on the run when he went to Arizona. And the dates and times and lining this up on any sort of timeline is kind of difficult because there was no census back then. Arizona wasn't a state. So a lot of the records we're getting are from the records that the Mormons kept. They were kind of keeping this Four Corners database set up, and who knows. But if you think about someone like Jacob Walls at the time, more or less on the run for stealing, he's not going to be too forthcoming about who he is, where he's from, what he's doing, and what his net worth may be or occupation. And he probably wasn't alone in that regard. That's probably not too unique of a scenario to think that these shady prospector guys who are roaming the deserts looking for their big break maybe have some skeletons in their closet. So what is known about Jacob Walls is, not a lot. It's different versus now where everything you do and say is recorded 7 different ways a Sunday. I'm recording this podcast right now, but I'm sure there's parts on my phone that are listening for keywords. Maybe like, hey Siri or something. But yeah, I think I got her. Yep. That didn't work out too good. I know. Hold on. When Siri jokes go bad. All right, moving on. So he had, again, very little luck prospecting and mining, but that was kind of his reputation when he arrived in Arizona, is his legacy kind of followed him, but he was seen going through the superstitions and coming back through the town. The town was called Goldfield. It's kind of located at the bottom of the superstitions, and kind of where camp was set up, saloons, things like that. Whatever you picture, it's probably accurate. But he was seen with large amounts of gold too. And the Sterling Legend, which is a great book if you want any more information, there's documents that he sold $250,000 worth of gold to the U.S. Mint over the course of the 1880s. So he was coming out with treasure. He would go in and come out. It's there, it's documented, and there isn't a lot to know about the details of where the mine is located in terms of Jacob Wall's accounts. He made a few pseudo, verbal maps, which are really to no help at all, but one quote from one entry he made, it says, "I'm standing at the entrance of the mine and I'm looking down the hill and seeing the military trail." So when the military would come do whatever they would do in the area, they obviously had their own trails, or maybe they're the only ones who would travel this far or whatever, but the horse and carriage soldier things, and he would see the men riding through, but they couldn't see him, kind of thing. And so if you think of where that could be, anywhere, but he knows where it's at, so it's almost like he's winking at everybody. So fast forward to 1891, and there was a catastrophic 100-year storm in Phoenix, giant flood that basically destroyed his farm and where he was homesteading at, and literally left him clinging to a tree for days. And during this time, he developed pneumonia, and he was rescued and taken under the care of a lady named Julia Thomas. Just not much known about her, but she tried her best to nurse him into some sort of stable condition, but he's pretty old at this time, and he died a few days later. And he died with $1,500 to his name and made a very weak deathbed confession telling Julia, hey, this is where I get all my money from. I pulled all this gold out my whole life. This is where the mine's at. And however that conversation went down, it didn't leave her with a glaringly obvious depiction of where the mine is, because she ended up making maps that she would sell for a staggering $7 a pop, but they clearly produced nothing and didn't work. So that's the story. That's all we really know about Jacob Waltz. There's accounts that there was a partner of sorts with his that he killed or something like that, and that can't really be verified anywhere near as close as what I just told you, so we'll leave that out. But if you're, again, one of the fact checkers and you come across this, like, hey, Joe, why don't you talk about that? And that's how fact checkers talk. They talk like this. That's not something that I could really find too much about, so I left it out. Anyway, where did Jacob learn about the mine? Good question. It was believed that he was told the location of a mine by an Apache girl named Ken-Tee, Ken-Tee. And so she's out wandering or collecting water, foraging, who knows, getting supplies for something, runs into Jacob, and Jacob's wandering around the desert with his burrow and whatever he's doing. And however the conversation started or talks began that let each other know that the other was cool and this was a good situation, she told him that there's a cave that has infinite riches, and she showed him. So this was a pretty, we can all agree, a pretty sacred piece of land, or an entrance to something that the Apache held very dear and protected. Because when the elders and some of the tribes members, quickly found out that Ken-Tee was the one who told Jacob about where the mine was, they cut out her tongue, and she was kind of placed back into the tribe as an example of, hey, if anybody wants to talk, this is what'll happen. But the odd thing is, they knew that Jacob was going into this place, but they didn't do anything about it. Again, this doesn't seem like the first time we've heard this story. But as it turns out, Jacob did meet his fate one way or another. But that story about Ken-Tee is similar to the story of Seth Tanner. And Seth Tanner was a Mormon pioneer, a pretty darn good one, around the same time in the 1860s, 1870s, was part of an exploration party in the area, in the Four Corners area, but focusing on the Grand Canyon. And he made his home on the Navajo reservation in northern Arizona, and he took a few wives in his years, and one of them was a Hopi woman. And he was kind of in, he wasn't necessarily a member of the tribe, but he married one of the women. And the Hopi were historically a very peaceful tribe, not really much about war, or anything you've read about the Apache is probably the opposite for the Hopi. So they gave him free rein. Yeah, the Grand Canyon's here. Go check this out, and this is where you'll find water. Maybe set things up here. Whatever. However they communicated, it's interesting to think about those dialogues. But the rule was, if you find a cave, stay out of it. That's it. Well, obviously he didn't. And he was going back and forth with this one particular cave that he found, which can't really find much about it, but it was, once it was brought to light that he was going in, they caught him in it, they held their trial for him, and they were going to kill him. But, it was brought up that he was married to one of theirs, his Hopi wife, and we can't kill him. He's one of us. So they made their potion, some sort of powder concoction, rubbed it in his eyes. They blinded him, and they left him, a little bit of vision so he could function and wander around. But it was his prospecting days were over, his exploring days were over, and you have to think, what did he see? What did he find? What did he keep going back to? How far was it? And they were obviously watching him from some distance, or maybe he was, caught in there by something. But what would make a tribe that peaceful in nature want to do that to essentially one of their own? You have to speculate to what's in there. So we're going to pivot to Geronimo. Geronimo was the chief of the Apache in the late 1800s. Everybody knows who Geronimo is, right? You've heard that name. Famous native chief of war. But yeah, he was the Apache chief, if you couldn't really associate where he was, laying his hat. Yeah, right here in Arizona. So he was famous for his amazing marksmanship, hunting raids, ability to, just dominate. And around 1886, he was in one of his many standoff battle with the U.S. government that's what the U.S. government was doing in that time. And that's a topic for a whole nother show, but we'll just leave it there. But he surrendered with his men in 1886, imprisoned, and he was sent to some sort of internment camp, pseudo prison in Florida, and then another one in Alabama, until arriving at Fort Sill, which is in present-day Oklahoma. And the interesting story is he was bargaining with one of the guards to let him out. And he apparently told the guard that, I can take you to a cave on my homeland in Arizona that is filled with more gold than you can imagine. And you have my word, I'll take you here, and, it's all yours. It has no value to me. Geronimo had kind of a checkered past, according to some people, about being a bit of a fibber. So the guardsmen didn't really put much stock into it, but the interesting thing is going on and on about where this cave is. The guard probably asked a few questions like, what, really? What do you mean? And he's like, I would watch you guys being your soldiers, on the trail, and I would see you from the cave entrance. So you have to think back to what Jacob Waltz was saying about where he would look and see the soldiers. And Geronimo would say the same thing. From the entrance of the cave, I could see you guys coming through. So we're probably talking about the same place. Anyway. Adolph Ruth. So Adolph Ruth was a pretty high-powered attorney living in California in the early 1900s, 1931. And he had a son who was starting out in his law career. And his son took a case where he was defending a younger man from a few, somewhat serious charges, but the man couldn't pay him in money, but instead offered to pay him in a map which led to a cave in the Superstation Mountains with lots and lots and lots of treasure. And of course, we're talking about the Lost Dutchman mine, and the young man was a Peralta. So it's interesting that the son of Adolph Ruth brought this to his dad and said, "Hey, what do you think? Does this check out? What do you want to do with this?" And he's like, "Oh my, I've heard of that. This is incredible. What an amazing coincidence. Yeah, let's go." And the son knew a little bit more by his dad's excitement that this was a place where people would go and not come back. So, hey, go for it, Dad. So in 1931, Adolph Ruth went on an expedition at the ripe old age of 66. He went by himself, and he never returned. But about 6 months later, they found his skull, and only his skull, and it had two very large holes in it. from bullets, allegedly. No body. Okay, so now what? Has the mine been found? Treasure? Anything? No. And are people still looking? Well, yeah. It's unfortunately a lot of people are still looking and still going missing. And this is an interesting case to touch on. In 2009, a gentleman by the name of Jesse Capon. Well, he was a bellboy who lived in Denver. He worked for 12 years at an overnight shift at a very nice hotel, and he was obsessed with the mine and the treasure. Owned over 100 books at his house about prospecting, gold rush, Lost Dutchman mine, things like that. Was just focused on it. All of his coworkers. I mean, you can imagine that working the overnight shift as a bellboy at a hotel in Denver, maybe during the winter, may yield some time for small talk. And I guess he would talk a lot about the day he can go search for the treasure. So 2009, in November, he went, and November is pretty much perfect to be in Arizona at that time. Mild nights, mild days, good weather. So in 2013, they found his unrolled sleeping bag, which suggested he may not have even made it one night. And his body was found at the base of a 30-foot sheer cliff. And it took so long to find it because it was almost wedged in a crevice at the bottom. And some of the accounts from the rescuers and search parties said they probably walked by it a few times, didn't even notice it. And that one's kind of chilling to think about. But we're going to skip up geographically to South Dakota, the Black Hills, a town called Black Hawk. May of 2020, that's right, just recently. There was a subdivision, about 30 houses, right outside the town of Black Hawk, and 12 of those houses had to be evacuated because they were on a sinkhole, and it gave out. And this sinkhole is actually a uranium mine. The Black Hills are very rich in uranium, and throughout the 1800s, 1900s, just mines were everywhere. And then they built houses on top of them because that's what people did is, don't ask, don't tell. Yeah, we'll build houses here, even though this land is not really usable. Anyway, this is what happens. So there were your first responders and paramedics, no one really got hurt. Everyone was able to get out okay. Things like that. And then the cavers came in to assess the area, and a few, historians, a few miners, things like that. And what the cavers found is the area was highly unstable, as you would imagine. And you saw your typical signs of an abandoned mine, trash and, bits of bottles and clothes, old carts, things like that, however they did business there. But they could see from the framework of the mine that it kept going. And through the walls of mud and soil and dirt, whatever was there, they were using some of their technology to see that this cave system went for miles and miles and miles. And they couldn't get through it, didn't necessarily want to, judging by how unsafe it is and how old it may have been. But the speculation was that the mine was simply a revisit of a pre-existing cave, which went on for a long, long time. And you think of the implications there with what we're talking about in the superstitions. And that particular land belongs to the Sioux, the Lakota. And we're going to tie all this together with a lot of the other native tribes. We're talking about the Hopi and the Navajo and the Sioux, Lakota, and the Apache, just for this episode, is they all believe that in a nutshell that man came from underground. There's a point of emergence where everyone came out, and we used to live underground of sorts. And if we were chased out, or if we came out being guided by great spirits, so we're out, well, who's there now? And who's there after us? It's interesting thoughts, because if you're going to tie this into the curse of the Thunder Gods, and how they believe that the Apache believe that once they came out, that this was now an entryway into the underworld. Like, what exactly is that? And if a lot of these tribes are protecting other people from going in there, and a few accounts of punishing people for going in there pretty severely, it just makes you wonder what's in there. And I feel like I'm articulating this decently, but really think about that. And there was a lot of moments where I was doing research for this, and it was, shit, that's crazy. So one thing I heard, we all, maybe some of us, there's the origins of mankind, which came from the Anunnaki. So raise your hand if you've heard of the Anunnaki, a few of you. Which is, depending on who you ask, the people or visitors from another planet who were able to, we're going to leave the Anunnaki part out, because that's a whole nother episode for another day. So cliffhanger there. But yeah, do your research on the Anunnaki, and I'll bid you good day in that regard. So here's what I found. This place is scary, and the superstitions are pretty ominous, pretty sinister just looking at them. If you don't know what they look like, when you arrive in the parking lot, it's just these giant, hundreds of foot tall rock spires. And if you didn't know any better, you'd say that they were just giants kind of frozen in time, which again is another episode for another day about the origins of giants. ... But when you arrive there, you feel like the energy is different, and it feels almost otherworldly by my account. In looking at some of these common threads of deaths and disappearances, and the curse of the Thunder Gods, and just the way this mine does exist, doesn't exist. Jacob Waltz doesn't have a lot of records about him. Who actually was Jacob Waltz? And how all of this is a lot of speculation and, urban legend is really, again, interesting. And during this research, there was a lot of times where I would just pause and put my hands on my head and kind of lean back and just think about it, like, what is this place? And the chilling part is it's right here. It's right down the road from my house. It's a 41-minute drive from where I'm recording this. And that goes into my thought at the beginning of the episode is what's actually around us. And that's something that, I empower everyone to do is look in your own backyard, look in your own neighborhood and what's there, and find out about it, because I tell you, we haven't done all the exploring. It hasn't all been figured out. We just kind of stopped. So anyway, back to my thought is I think there are things in the superstitions, like strange things. And the show is Find It, and I'm going to leave this one as something that you may not actually want to find. I'm not going into the superstitions. I'm not hiking in there. There's some fun trails you can run, and that's about it in the lower levels, and I'm good. And I don't know. But what about the mine, Joe? Where is it? Does it exist? Any of it? Can we find it? Drone footage? Google Earth? Satellite imagery? Anything? No, it's not there. But again, is it worth it? And I feel like there's a real force in the superstitions protecting something deep inside, and whatever that force is, it's fucking undefeated. So if you're looking for a fast track to being wealthy beyond your wildest dreams and mass fortune, I feel like you don't need to unearth cursed mines. Just start a creepy podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode of Find It, keep it going. Help us out. Lean into it. If you didn't, well shit, I don't know. I really like this one, so here we are. But please like, subscribe, leave a review. All these things, they just take a minute. And wherever you heard this, it's on a lot of platforms, but just leave a note. Or DM me at Find It Radio on Instagram is the one I check a lot. But tell me what's up. Tell me what you think. Got something for me to talk about? Happy to have you. But remember, every little bit you do helps us accomplish some of the goals we have for this show and beyond. So thank you. And for Find It, I'm Joe. Keep looking.